Happy Friday. It is somehow already the first week of June, and we are 5 months into 2024, which seems crazy. In keeping with that, I'm going to do a wrap up of the books that I read in May. The quick stats are that I read 17 books, 15 of which were historical fiction novels, one thriller, and one nonfiction book. We will put up a list of all 17 books that I read, but we are going to go through my top 5 for the month of May. Let's get into it. Sitting at number 5 for the month of May, we have the book Diva. It's written by Daisy Goodwin. Now, I've read Daisy Goodwin's other books, and this one is by far my favorite. It's about Maria Callas, who is an opera singer post World War II, and she's considered one of the best sopranos to ever sing in an opera. It was super interesting. I didn't know anything about her when I picked up this book, and I was super excited to learn about her life and what happened to her. The front book cover says beautiful, visceral, tragic, gutting, which is always just a place where I'm like, I'm jumping into that for sure. What was very cool about Maria's story is that while she was born in the United States to Greek parents, her mom took her and her sister back to Greece, and they lived there during the Axis occupation of Greece, which was something that I knew nothing about. And while they do not get into it very much in the book, I then did some research on the side, and it was very cool to learn about something that I didn't know about yet. And that was a real joy. Maria's life is fascinating as she travels the world and sings and tries to balance the strain of performing with how fun life can be when you are living it up, especially in the 1950s across all of Europe, where things were jubilant in a lot of places, especially places where there was a lot of money, which, as we all know, is true for opera and the people who go. And it's interesting to watch her balance a life that she possibly could want to live and the life that she needs to live in order to be able to sing, which is what she truly loves. The book is a fascinating story of her life. One of the things that I thought was a drawback about this book is there's not an author's note in the book. I listened to the audiobook while I read it, and there was a note at the end of that talked through the realities of Maria's world, which I really, really liked, but it's not in the hard copy, which is a drawback for me. Coming in at number 4 for the month of May is The Last Queen. It's written by Chitra Banerjee Divrakarni, and I'm so sorry for butchering that name. I had read another novel by her last year called Independence, which was phenomenal, and this book was also excellent. I really enjoyed getting into the story. It's about a young girl who, in 1800s India, which at the time was referred to as Hindustan, she unexpectedly meets the king when she is very, very young, and they fall in love. I guess I don't know how that happens with a teenager and a 40-year-old man, but it happens apparently. And he has her wait in her village until she's 18. And once she comes back to the capital, and they're married. And for the last couple of years of his life, they are together. And it's a fascinating story about this time in Indian culture when they're trying to hold off the British for as long as possible and trying to keep their kingdom from becoming another piece of the British Empire. And what does it look like when kings who have held on to power for so long and kept the British at bay start to die, and what happens to India when that occurs. And it was a fascinating story about a woman who was very strong and fought for what she wanted and fought for her family, and what history shows about that, and where that landed her. And it was a really great book. I really enjoyed getting to spend my time in 1800s India for just a little while, and it was an absolutely fascinating read. Coming in at number 3 for the month of May is Between Earth and Sky by Amanda Scannendor. I've read Amanda's other work, which I have really enjoyed. This is actually her first novel, and so I was excited to pick it up. It was my first book of May, and it stuck with me the whole month. And it's a fascinating dual timeline that goes back and forth between the main character, Alma is her name, her childhood, and her current life, which is based in 1906. She reads a newspaper article learning that one of her childhood friends is being accused of murdering a federal agent. Now, Alma grew up in Wisconsin, and she her parents had a school that was meant to tame Indians, and in the wake of the Indian Wars, there were children that were sent to these schools. Now, this is a fictional school with fictional people and fictional events. However, these schools were very real all across America, trying to assimilate Native Americans into white culture. And it's what I found very fascinating and just harrowing was that throughout this story, you can see Alma has been through something traumatic. So something happened while she was at the school that has separated her from her parents and has made her life two parts. It truly is two parts. It's her life in Wisconsin and then her life now in Philadelphia with her husband. And her husband knows very little about where she came from or what happened to her. And so as we go through the book, we know that there's something that's coming, and we do obviously eventually learn what it is. And it was a fascinating story as she's like on one side of the timeline learning about herself and her new friends at the school, and then on this other timeline again learning about herself and what the people who were her friends and what happened to them after being at the school. And it was just such a wonderful piece of storytelling, and I really, really enjoyed the book, as devastating as the storylines were and how traumatizing it was for these children. I enjoyed getting to find compassion and understanding for what that must have been like almost 150 years ago, being treated this way and to have your life so different than what it could have been. And it was a very fascinating read. I really enjoyed it, and I would highly recommend it. For my second book in May 2024, I am picking Becoming Madam Secretary by Stephanie Dray. Stephanie Dray is one of my all-time favorite authors. We will at some point get into her other books that I absolutely love, but this one was a very fun surprise for me. I was not sure. There were two things I wasn't sure about. One, how much fun can a book about a cabinet secretary be? It's impossible to know, right? Doesn't sound super exciting. And then two, what cabinet secretary was this about? Because I didn't know who Frances Perkins was. Frances Perkins was the first ever female cabinet secretary in the US. She was FDR's labor secretary, and that was after years of fighting for justice for workers all across America in a lot of different spaces, specifically in New York. And she spent a lot of time trying to protect people who couldn't be protected. And what was super fascinating about Frances's life was that she was battling for these things at a time when she herself couldn't vote because she was a woman. And it was very fascinating to read such an inspirational story. What Stephanie Dray has done here, though, that's very cool, is while all of Frances's work and accomplishments have been very well documented, because it wasn't that long ago, her personal life has not been as well documented. And what Stephanie has done here is created a narrative around how difficult it was to be the woman who Frances was, as well as the person who her family needed to support. And it was an incredible way to look at somebody's life and see how truly difficult it is to balance all of the things that we ask, specifically women, to balance all the time. I really enjoyed getting to read this book. I, in fact, couldn't put it down, which sounds crazy when I tell you that I'm talking about the narrative of a life of a cabinet secretary and not Department of Defense or, any kind of war. We're just talking about labor. And it was fascinating because I just wanted to know what Frances was going to do next, what her life was going to look like. And I really enjoyed getting to hear Stephanie Dray describe her struggles and the things that she fought for and the ideals that were in a lot of ways we've conquered some of them, but in some ways we're still looking to defeat some of the things that Frances was looking to solve in the 1930s and 40s. It was a great book. I highly recommend it. Anything written by Stephanie Dray is 10 out of 10 a recommendation in my book, but this was one of my absolute favorites from May. My top book for the month of May is Finding Margaret Fuller, written by Allison Pataki. Now, I have read other works by Allison Pataki as well, and one of the things that she does is that she takes a chapter from later in the book and makes it the prologue. So you get to know where we're going a little bit in the story, which I really like, because then you're trying to figure out how we're going to get to where we are. Now, in the prologue, it told me there were two things that I knew about Margaret Fuller going into reading this, and both of them were reiterated in the prologue. The two things that I knew from having read a different historical fiction book was that she was a part of the Transcendentalist movement that took place really in Concord, Massachusetts, around the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they were quite close friends. That was one of the things I knew. The other thing that I knew was that she died in a shipwreck off the coast of New York, and that is how the book starts. And then we go back to the beginning of her life and her finding herself, and we learn how Margaret ended up on this boat coming back from Italy to New York after a time abroad. And what is absolutely fascinating about this book was that those were the only two things I knew about Margaret Fuller. And I read quite a bit, and it was fascinating that there's this group of people who were referred to as the Transcendentalist movement, and there was this center of genius in Concord, Massachusetts, with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, and Nathaniel Hawthorne all living in the same town at the same time. And the person who was also there was Margaret Fuller. And even though she wrote plenty and produced many, many important works and contributed in many ways to society, I had never heard of her. I didn't read her in school. There was never a time that I had the pleasure of getting to know who she was or what her story was. And it was very fascinating to then get to read about her life and just how inspirational she was, and just how devastating it is to look at history, looking back and seeing all of the ways that she contributed to movements that she wasn't then alive for, including the suffrage movement to try and get women the right to vote in the 1900s, and just how she was so ahead of where all of these other women were. She was an absolutely fascinating person, and I really enjoyed getting to spend some time in her head through Allison Pataki, and it was so phenomenal to get to enjoy that. And I loved how well researched this was, and just getting to enjoy learning about another person in another time. It was such a phenomenal read, and I 10 out of 10 recommend it. It was definitely my favorite book of May. That's my wrap up for May. All 5 of those books were phenomenal. I read a lot of great books in May, and it is always so fun for me to get to look back and try and decide which books I thought were the best. It is hard. I had some that came in right there to vie for one of the top 5 spots, and it was fun to get to try and pick which ones were the best to share with you all. I would love to hear what your favorite book of May was, so please drop that in the comments. We would love to hear from you. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Happy reading!